Hi, my name is John Sluter. I'm your Bible friend from Purdue. This is Saul, Part 7. We're working our way through 1 Shemuel, or 1 Samuel, however you want to pronounce it. And the theme of today is amazement and change. Because we're going to discuss chapter 9 of 1 Shemuel and a little bit of chapter 10. Saul is amazed, perplexed, when he discovers from the prophet Shemuel his destiny. Shortly after that, he becomes a new person. By the end of the last episode, Saul and his servant had decided that they were going to consult a seer, a prophet, to see if perhaps he would help them locate the donkeys that they had been searching for a number of days. They go to the town where the servant happens to know that the seer can often be found. They encounter some girls. The girls give them explicit directions to the seer, and they go on from there. That's where we pick up now. They do encounter Shemuel. They encounter him in the town gate. That's an appropriate meeting place. In those times, important persons gathered at the town gate or at the city gate. They approach Shemuel not knowing who it was. But Shemuel knew who Saul was. He knows because God had told him the day before that he would be meeting the man whom God had appointed to be the King of Israel on this day. And when he lays eyes on Saul, God tells Shemuel, this is the man. This is the one who is going to deliver the Israelites. I'm paraphrasing, of course. So, Saul and his servant approach Shemuel. And Saul asks Shemuel, this man, if he can tell him where the seer is. And Shemuel answers him. I'm going to quote directly from Robert Alter's translation of what Shemuel answers Saul. But as I read this, please try to keep in mind Saul's state of mind so you can gauge his amazement at the answer that he is given. And I think two very important things to bear in mind in that regard are this. First of all, when Saul and his servant determined that they were going to ask the seer for help in finding their donkeys, they determined that they needed to give the seer a little something, as it were, to grease his palm to enlist his assistance. The second thing is that Saul doesn't think this man knows anything about him. So far as Saul is concerned, he's approaching a total stranger. And this is what Shemuel answers. I am the seer. Go up before me to the high place, and you will eat with me today. And I shall send you off in the morning, and whatever is in your heart I shall tell you. And as to the asses that have been lost to you now these 3 days, pay them no heed, for they have been found. And whose is all the treasure of Israel? Is it not for you and all your father's house? Saul, in his perplexity, responds. To me, the way he responds foreshadows in a way the response of the Virgin Mary at the time of the Annunciation. Both of them are greatly perplexed. This is what Saul says. Reading again from Robert Alter's translation. Saul says, "Am I not a Benjamite, from the smallest of the tribes of Israel, and my clan is the least of all the tribes of Benjamin? So why have you spoken to me in this fashion?" He sounds perplexed, doesn't he? And one surprise follows another. Shemuel takes Saul up and his servant up on the mountain to the feast, and he just doesn't give Saul any seat. He seats him at the head of the table, the place of honor among the 30 people who are gathered for the feast. Not only does he seat him at the head of the table, but in a moment that somewhat echoes the way that Elkanah gave Hannah the double portion of meat, Shemuel confers upon Saul, has the cook put in front of him, the thigh, which is a choice piece of meat. It's also a rather large piece of meat, so large that I would be astonished if one person could eat it. We can guess what Saul might have done with the part of the feast, his portion that he did not eat. He could have parceled it out to other people who were present, an exercise in patronage, a skill that he would have to master as a king. Or maybe it was simply the custom of the time to leave what was not eaten for the servants to enjoy after the feast. Whatever might be the case, it's clear that Saul received a huge portion in deference to his new status. The fact that Saul is to be made king is not proclaimed at the feast. The other people at the feast must have been a little bit baffled as to why this unknown person, this young man, is being treated with such high honor. There was probably a buzz generated, and maybe it even percolated out through Israel. But secrecy was nominally maintained. We'll talk about that a little bit later as to why. After the feast, Shemuel invites Saul to stay overnight at his house. Saul sleeps on the roof. It's a place of honor where guests sleep. It's cool up there. There's a breeze. At dawn, Shemuel calls up to Saul to send him on. And again, there's this sense of secrecy as Shemuel confides in Saul, but before he does that, he tells Saul to send his servant on ahead. It makes sense, the secrecy. Israel is under occupation by the Philistines. If the Philistines found out that a king had arisen in Israel before the king had the opportunity to take steps to protect himself, no doubt they would go all Herod on him. They would quench his kingship before it could begin. After the young servant has gone ahead, Shemuel anoints Saul with oil and proclaims him a prince. And he tells Saul that 3 things are going to happen as Saul proceeds. I'm going to describe them briefly. but then I'm going to go back and talk about each one of them a little bit more and try to tease out what they might mean. The first thing that happens is that by the tomb of Rachel, Saul is going to encounter two men who tell him that his donkeys have been recovered and his father is worried about him. A little bit further on, Saul is going to encounter three men going up to Bethel to sacrifice before the Lord. One of them will be carrying three kids, three small goats. Another one will be carrying 3 loaves of bread, and the third one will be carrying a jug of wine. They're going to give Saul 2 of the loaves. Saul's going to take them. And then they're going to go to a third place where there is a garrison of Philistines. Saul is going to encounter some prophets. The prophets are going to be in a prophetic frenzy and speaking in tongues, as it were. Saul will too. And at that point, Shemuel promises Saul will become a different person. The text says that as Saul turned to go, God gave Saul a new heart. What does that mean? Why then? I think what it means is that Saul felt unburdened by these predictions, by these prophecies. I think somewhere inside of him, he was anxious that he was being taken in by a crank. And he knew that these amazing prophecies would either take place or they would not. If they didn't, then he would know that there was nothing to what Shemuel said. He could just forget about it. He would have an amusing story to tell about this loon, this gray-beard crazy man who told him that he was going to be king of Israel. But if they came about, then he would know that Shemuel was a prophet. Saul and his servant go. The first meeting predicted by Shemuel takes place. At Rachel's tomb, they encounter 2 men. The 2 men tell them that Saul's father Kish has recovered the donkeys. Now he's worried about Saul. This vindicates Shemuel. It shows he's not just some crank. The very thing he said would happen has happened. But there's something more going on here. There's something symbolically very important, and it has to do with Rachel's tomb. Who was Rachel? For one thing, Rachel was a woman who, like Hannah, was initially on the losing side of a rivalry with her husband's other wife concerning the bearing of children. Her husband was Jacob. Jacob is also known as Israel. He had 12 children through 2 wives and 2 servants. These children became the name ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel. Of those 12 children, Rachel had 2. One was Joseph. The other, significantly, was Benjamin. Saul is of the tribe of Benjamin. But it's even more important what's going on symbolically than just that. Rachel died giving birth to Benjamin. This grave, this tomb then, stands for both a birth and a death. In order for the reign of kings in Israel to begin, the reign of judges, of people like Shemuel, has to come to an end, has to die. And that's represented by this first encounter by Rachel's tomb. As the narrative unfolds, it turns out that Saul's dynasty, if you can even call it that, ends tragically. So even here, at this meeting, at the beginning of his reign, at the birth of his reign, perhaps the author is anticipating and foreshadowing the tragic end, the death of his reign, and indeed the tragic death of Saul himself. Saul and his servant go on to the terebinth of Tabor. A terebinth is a kind of a tree. Turpentine is made from its bark. Tabor might be more significant. That name is associated with a mountain that is associated with one of ancient Israel's great victories. The judge Deborah and her general Barak gathered their troops on the summit of Mount Tabor. Then they swept down and defeated Sisera. If a great victory like that is associated with the reign of Saul, it is an auspicious sign. But there is a far less auspicious event associated by at least some with Mount Tabor. Some scholars believe that it is on the summit of Mount Tabor that the sons of the judge Gideon were slaughtered. So you have then, in the name Tabor, associations with victory and with death, associated with the beginning of Saul's reign. At the terebinth of Tabor, Saul and his servant encounter 3 men on their way to Bethel to sacrifice to the Lord. The men give Saul 2 loaves of bread. What does that mean? My best surmise is drawn from the book of Leviticus. In Leviticus, there are 2 things that seem to occupy a liminal state, not quite unclean. People can eat them, and priests can eat them, but it's not quite perfect, so that these cannot be offered on the altar of God. One of these is honey, and the other is loaves of bread, that is, bread that has risen because of being infused with yeast. Why is that? My supposition, again, is that in the minds of the ancient Israelites, bread was in a way alive, not quite alive, but in a way alive. What it had was like life. Because of the yeast in it, and they didn't know anything about microorganisms, of course, but because of the yeast in it, it rose, and that was like life. But it stopped rising. And when it was baked, there was no possibility after that that it could rise again. And that was like death, not death, because it was not quite alive, so it didn't quite die, but something like death. And to put that succinctly, bread is not quite alive and not quite dead. This makes it somewhat like the Church of Laodicea in the 3rd chapter of Revelation. Neither hot nor cold. Therefore, God was about to spit that church out of his mouth. Maybe the bread is a symbol for the reign of Saul, explains why he was successful and why he failed. Or perhaps bread has a dual meaning here, representing the two directions that Saul's reign could go depending upon choices that he makes. On one hand, bread is sustenance. That's a good thing. On the other hand, it has this liminal quality. From the terebinth of Tabor, Saul and his servant proceed to Gibeath Elohim. That name means Hill of God. As Shemuel predicted, as he prophesied, there they encountered a roving band of prophets, and that roving band whipped themselves in to a prophetic frenzy. Saul joined them in the frenzy. As Professor Alter points out, these roving bands of frenzied prophets had an ambiguous position in society. To some people, they were authentically touched by God. They were deserving of respect and admiration. To other people, they were just a bunch of crazies that acted like drunkards. There was a Philistine garrison in this town, and that's significant. It's significant because earlier we talked about the need for secrecy for Saul before he was safely ensconced with his bodyguard and other measures of safety to protect him from reprisal or anticipatory assassination by the Philistines. We also talked about the impossibility of keeping this a secret because of the buzz that must have been generated at the feast where Shemuel honored this handsome, tall stranger. There can be no doubt that the Philistines had a spy network, had informants throughout Israel. They must have heard rumors about this Israelite king. It would seem counterintuitive to send Saul right to a garrison town where he was subject to immediate assassination if he was identified as this king. But in fact, that was the safest place for him to be, given the fact that he went into this prophetic frenzy. My supposition is that the Philistines did not buy in to the authenticity of these prophetic frenzies. And so they regarded these people as a bunch of crazies. And when Saul joined them, what better safety was there for him than a reputation as a lunatic? Usually, there's a lot going on in Scripture, and that's true of these three encounters that we've just been looking at. In each of these places, at Rachel's tomb, at the terebinth of Tabor, and at Gibeath Elohim, Saul receives something that is distinct from what he gets at the other two places. At Rachel's tomb, he gets information. At the terebinth of Tabor, he gets sustenance. At Gibeath Elohim, he gets spirit. These are all things that kings need. They are things that people generally need. It's as if these three meetings, these three encounters, represent each a promise by God through Shemuel that he will meet Saul's needs as Saul goes about his royal duties. But it's worth bearing in mind that God's freedom cannot be curtailed. He always has the freedom to withhold the benefit of any promise he has made if the person who has received that promise does not live up to his or her obligation of obedience. The next thing that happens is that Saul encounters his uncle. His uncle has natural questions. How did the trip go? Saul tells him very little. He says nothing about being anointed as a prince or selected as a king. All he tells him is that he encountered the prophet Shemuel. The uncle asks a natural question. One wonders, however, whether it might be a pointed question. One wonders if perhaps he has heard the rumors. He asks, what did Shemuel say? All that Saul tells him is, he said the donkeys have been found. And Shemuel gathers the people of Israel at Mizpah to anoint Saul. He casts lots. The lots fall to Saul. He's ready to anoint him as king. But Saul is nowhere to be found. The Lord tells Shemuel he's hiding with the gear. Why? I don't think it's hard to figure out. Saul may have loved his life. He's a young man with a great deal of freedom. And he was being asked to undertake an onerous responsibility. He was being asked to take responsibility for liberating the people of Israel from a ruthless, skillful, entrenched foe. So if he was ambivalent, nobody could blame him. There were people in the crowd who really made it known that they wanted nothing to do with this young man. And ironically, because Saul himself was ambivalent, he was resentful of their resentment. But he kept it to himself. Samuel dismissed the people to their homes, and everybody went home, including Saul. In the next section, we'll see Saul take up with vigor his responsibility for the defense of Israel. Hi, I'm John Sluter. I see my headphones shaking behind me, and that means, that my little dog is here. Yes, I thought that since I've spoken about her, I might as well introduce you to her. This is my little friend that you hear snoring. You can see that she's small, which means that she has a very high weight to horsepower ratio. Okay, I'm going to put her down and we're going to get started. Okay, there you go. Good morning. Hello, I'm John Sluter. I'm your Bible friend from Purdue.